At first glance, the headline writes itself. ISFAHAN Airbase destroyed. Iran's military in chaos. The Revolutionary Guards and the regular army turning on each other behind the scenes. It sounds like the kind of war story that spreads fast because it feels complete. One strike, one collapse, one secret explanation. But the verified version is more careful, and honestly, more revealing. Because what public reporting actually supports is this. Israeli strikes appear to have dealt a significant blow to Iranian air assets and airfield infrastructure around Isfahan, including aircraft and support areas linked to the 8th Tactical Airbase. Satellite imagery reviewed in public reporting showed at least 2 Iranian F-14 Tomcats destroyed there, while other open-source analysis described damaged hangars and cratered runways or taxiways in the Isfahan area. That is serious, that matters. But it is not the same thing as saying the base was vaporized, and the second half of the viral claim matters just as much. There's a real distinction inside Iran's military system between the regular army, known as the Artesh, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. That distinction has shaped Iranian power for decades, but based on the material available here, the strongest public claim is not that the IRGC definitively turned on the regular army in some openly confirmed internal showdown. The stronger claim is that battlefield stress may be intensifying older institutional tensions inside a dual military structure that has never worked like a conventional unified command in the first place. That difference is the key to telling this story properly. Because the real story is not a Hollywood-style internal coup, it is a war pressure test. And Isfahan may be one of the clearest windows we have into what that pressure test looks like when an air campaign starts hitting symbols, logistics, legacy aircraft, and the confidence of a military system that was already carrying deep structural contradictions. Let's start with the airbase itself. Isfahan matters because it is not just another dot on the map. Public reporting has tied the area to important Iranian aviation assets, including the 8th Tactical Airbase, which has long been associated with Iran's remaining F-14 fleet. Business Insider reported, based on satellite imagery from a spatial intelligence firm, that at least 2 F-14 Tomcats were destroyed there following Israeli strikes. The same reporting noted damage to several F-7 jets as well. Iran is the world's last operator of the F-14, a platform inherited from before the 1979 revolution, and kept flying for decades under sanctions and extraordinary maintenance pressure. That matters symbolically as much as tactically. The F-14 is not just an old aircraft. In the Iranian military imagination, it is one of the last visible remnants of a once more advanced air arm. Even if many of these aircraft were already aging, difficult to maintain, and less relevant in a high-end modern air war, their destruction sends a message. It says that legacy prestige assets are not safe. It says that shelters, air bases, and even historically protected aviation hubs can still be reached. And when a military starts losing symbolic assets on camera and by satellite, the damage spreads beyond the runway. It moves into morale, perception, and command confidence. This is why the word vaporized can actually weaken the analysis. If a base had truly been erased in one clean, total event, the story would be straightforward. But that is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence supports is degradation, damaged aircraft, damaged infrastructure, likely reduced sortie potential, and visible disruption to Iran's ability to preserve parts of its air power. Open-source imagery summaries described cratering on Isfahan airfields and damage to hangars and structures. That paints a picture of a base under heavy stress, not necessarily a base erased from existence. And in modern war, degradation can be more consequential than destruction. A runway does not have to vanish permanently to become a problem. A hangar does not have to be flattened beyond recognition to lose its operational value. An aircraft does not need to be the majority of a fleet to become strategically important if it represented one of the last usable airframes of a rare type. Damage adds friction. Friction slows repair. Slower repair affects dispersal, readiness, crew confidence, and command decisions. In other words, even if Isfahan was not vaporized, it may still have become significantly less useful at exactly the moment Iran needed resilience. Now step back and widen the frame. AP reported that Israel has conducted around 7,600 airstrikes on Iran in this war, while broader reporting described thousands of targets hit across Iranian military infrastructure. CENTCOM statements and related public reporting described U.S. operations targeting command and control facilities, missile and drone launch sites, air defense systems, military airfields, and associated infrastructure. Whatever the precise target counts, the broad strategic pattern is unmistakable. The campaign is aimed to degrade Iran's military system layer by layer, not just score isolated headline strikes. That context is crucial, because Isfahan was not being struck in isolation. It was one node in a much broader effort to strip Iran of air defense depth, missile responsiveness, and command certainty. And this is where the question of IRGC versus regular army becomes more interesting. Iran does not operate a standard military hierarchy in the way many outside observers assume. The Artesh, the regular armed forces, and the IRGC overlap but do not fully merge. They have different histories, different institutional loyalties, different mission profiles, and different political roles. The regular army traditionally handled conventional defense and state military functions. The IRGC evolved as an ideological force designed not only to fight wars, but to defend the revolution itself and maintain regime security. Over time, the IRGC expanded into missile forces, external operations, business networks, and internal political power. That has long created a structural imbalance. Even in calmer periods, the IRGC was not just another branch, it was a parallel pillar of the system. So when wartime pressure mounts, the question is not whether friction could exist. Of course it could. The real question is what kind of friction becomes visible first. The limited reporting available here suggests the possibility of growing stress fractures. One-sided analysis summarized reporting of shortages, desertions, and deeper friction between the regular army and the Revolutionary Guards. That should be treated carefully, because it is not the same as a fully independently confirmed official split. It fits a familiar pattern in states with parallel security institutions. When battlefield outcomes worsen, the struggle over blame, access, logistics, and prestige can intensify very quickly. And that brings us back to Isfahan. An airbase strike is not just a military event. It is also an accountability event. Someone was responsible for protecting the asset. Someone was responsible for dispersal plans. Someone was responsible for air defense coverage. Someone was responsible for assessing the threat level and preserving aircraft on the ground. If a strategically meaningful aviation site gets hit hard, bureaucratic and institutional politics begin immediately, even if the public never sees them. Was the warning ignored? Was the regular Air Force undersupported? Did the IRGC prioritize its own networks over shared defense? Were legacy airbases left exposed because missile and internal security priorities dominated the system? Those are exactly the kinds of questions that can inflame pre-existing military tensions. That is a much stronger and more credible story than the IRGC just turned on the regular army. Because institutions rarely turn in one cinematic moment. What they do instead is compete under pressure. They hoard access. They protect reputations. They shift blame. They argue over resources. And when one branch is more ideological and politically protected than the other, that process can become deeply corrosive. The regular army may see itself paying for failures in a system it does not fully control. The IRGC may see itself as the only force trusted to preserve regime continuity under external attack. In peacetime, that tension can be managed. In wartime, especially during repeated strikes on airbases, command sites, and internal security targets, it can sharpen fast. There's another layer here too: mission mismatch. The IRGC and the Artesh are not optimized for the same things. The IRGC's rise came with investments in missiles, asymmetric warfare, internal security, and expeditionary proxy networks. The regular Air Force, by contrast, has long operated under the burden of aging platforms, sanctions, and uneven modernization. So when a war suddenly tests conventional air survivability, hardened airbase infrastructure, aircraft dispersal, and classical air defense, the system's uneven development becomes brutally visible. A strike on Isfahan exposes not just a single base, but a whole long-term strategic choice. What had Iran really prioritized? And what had it allowed to age into vulnerability? This helps explain why the destruction of a handful of aircraft can echo so loudly. If the public only sees 2 lost F-14s, it might sound minor compared to the scale of the wider war. But if those aircraft sit inside a much smaller and older fleet, and if the base hosting them is associated with one of the last visible elements of Iran's conventional air legacy, then the signal is larger than the count. It tells every observer, inside and outside Iran, that the state's older conventional air arm may be more exposed than its propaganda suggests. And that has political consequences. Because in systems with overlapping armed institutions, battlefield embarrassment is never evenly distributed. An exposed airbase can become evidence in an internal argument. Was this the result of strategic neglect? Was too much prestige and funding channeled into the wrong military ecosystem? Did the IRGC's political power distort defense planning? Or, from the other side, did the regular army fail to adapt and preserve its assets despite years of warning? Public sources cannot answer those internal questions definitively, but they can show why those questions would become sharper after a strike like this. And once those questions sharpen, the language of betrayal tends to follow, even when the underlying reality is slower and less dramatic. For years, one of the biggest misconceptions about Iran's military has been the idea that it operates as one seamless machine. From the outside, it can look that way: one flag, one command structure, one strategic message. But beneath that image sits a far more complicated reality. Iran has not one military center of gravity, but 2. On one side is the Artesh, the regular army, air force, navy, and ground forces built around the traditional state. On the other is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, a parallel power structure with its own ground forces, aerospace arm, internal security role, political influence, and privileged access to the country's strategic priorities. And now, after strikes around Isfahan, that internal imbalance is suddenly impossible to ignore. Because the most important question may not be whether Iran was hit. It is which part of Iran got hit, who got protected, and who is now paying the price inside the system. The viral version of this story says the IRGC turned on Iran's army. That specific claim is not confirmed in the public record. There is no solid evidence in the sources provided that the IRGC and Artesh have entered an openly acknowledged military confrontation with each other at Isfahan, but the verified version is still dramatic. Open source and analytical reporting indicates that the Isfahan area saw strikes against both Artesh-linked air assets and IRGC, or base IJ-linked facilities, while broader wartime reporting suggests the IRGC is emerging even more dominant within Iran's state as the conflict deepens. In other words, the real story is not a cinematic coup scene. It is the exposure of a power struggle that may have already existed under the surface, and that battlefield pressure is now making much harder to conceal. Let's start with Isfahan itself, because geography matters here. Isfahan is not just another Iranian city. It is a strategic military zone tied to air bases, military aviation, and broader infrastructure important to central Iran's defense posture. The Institute for the Study of War and Critical Threats project assessed that strikes in and around Isfahan likely hit the 8th Tactical Air Base, an Artesh Air Force installation that hosts aircraft, including F-14s, along with another Artesh aviation base in the area. At nearly the same time, Israeli statements and subsequent analytical assessments pointed to strikes on IRGC ground forces and base IJ or internal security infrastructure in Isfahan province as well. That means this was not a one-dimensional attack on a single military branch. It was pressure applied against multiple layers of Iran's coercive apparatus in the same region. And that is exactly why the Isfahan story matters. When outside pressure falls equally on all institutions, regimes often respond by closing ranks. But when it falls unevenly, or when different institutions suffer different kinds of losses, it can expose who matters most and who is treated as expendable. The Artesh has long occupied an awkward place in the Islamic Republic. It is essential to national defense, but it has never enjoyed the same ideological prestige or political influence as the IRGC. The Guard is not just a military arm. It is a regime security institution, a political actor, and a power network deeply embedded in the state. So, when wartime conditions intensify, there's a built-in risk that the IRGC gets priority, while the regular military absorbs losses without the same authority, visibility, or leverage. That does not automatically mean open betrayal, but it does mean the structure is primed for resentment. Now look at the broader trend. The Washington Post reported on March 16th that U.S. intelligence assessments suggest the Iranian regime is likely to remain intact, but in a weakened form that is becoming more dominated by the IRGC. That is a crucial point. The strikes were not producing obvious state collapse. Instead, they appeared to be contributing to an internal hardening process in which the most ideologically entrenched and security-focused institution gains even more weight. If that assessment is right, then any damage to Artesh-linked assets in Isfahan does not just represent military attrition. It also represents a possible shift in internal balance. The more the regular military is weakened, the more central the Guard becomes to regime survival. And the more central the Guard becomes, the less room remains for institutions that were already politically secondary. That makes the Isfahan strikes feel bigger than the damage alone, because this is not just about runways, hangars, and aircraft. It is about hierarchy. Analytical reporting indicates the strikes were part of a broader effort to suppress Iran's air defenses and maintain air superiority over central Iran. That campaign includes damaging runways, taxiways, aircraft shelters, air defense systems, and support infrastructure. From a warfighting perspective, that makes sense, but from an internal Iranian perspective, it raises a difficult question. When the regular air force gets hit, who rebuilds, who commands, and who gains political advantage from the loss? If the answer is increasingly the IRGC, then every Artesh setback can widen the regime's internal asymmetry. This is where many viewers miss the deeper story. In Iran, the IRGC and Artesh are not simply duplicate institutions. They were designed with different purposes. The Artesh is the traditional national military. The IRGC was created to defend the revolution and the regime. Over time, that distinction became a distinction in privilege too. The Guard built influence not only through military roles, but through politics, intelligence, internal repression, missile forces, and economic reach. So, in moments of national emergency, the institution with the strongest ties to regime preservation is naturally positioned to dominate the response. That does not require an order saying, "turn on the army." The imbalance is already built into the system. War simply makes it visible. And the public evidence from this war keeps pointing in that direction. AP reporting has described a conflict in which the United States and Israel have targeted not only missile and air defense infrastructure, but also internal security infrastructure inside Iran. That matters because internal security is one of the IRGC's great institutional advantages. The Guard and affiliated bodies such as the Basij are central to preserving internal order, especially during crises. If airbases and conventional military infrastructure take damage while internal security structures are also targeted but politically prioritized, the likely result is not unity but institutional stress. Different branches begin operating under different incentives. Some are tasked with fighting external threats. Others are tasked with protecting the regime from internal fallout. That difference can become combustible fast. There's another reason Isfahan stands out: symbolism. If an Artesh-linked airbase near such a strategic city is damaged while the country is already under severe pressure, it sends a message inside the chain of command. It tells every officer in the regular military that even core national defense infrastructure is vulnerable. But it also raises a more sensitive issue: who gets blamed for that vulnerability? In highly centralized authoritarian systems, military failure rarely stays a neutral technical matter. It becomes political. People ask whether the intelligence was shared, whether the air defenses were adequate, whether resources were distributed fairly, and whether some institutions were better protected than others. Those are the kinds of questions that do not need public answers to have internal consequences. Some of the more sensational claims online go beyond what can be verified. There are tabloids and highly partisan outlets suggesting extreme levels of desertion, medical neglect, or direct IRGC refusal to support wounded Artesh personnel. Those reports are not independently established by the strongest sources here, so they should not be treated as settled fact. But even without relying on those claims, the structural problem is still plain enough. When one military system exists to defend the nation and another exists to defend the revolution, wartime strain does not affect them equally. Damage to the regular military can weaken the country. Damage to the IRGC can threaten the regime. In a crisis, regimes tend to prioritize themselves. That is the logic that makes the current moment in Iran so dangerous internally, even if a full IRGC versus Artesh rupture has not been publicly confirmed. This also helps explain why the IRGC's rise under pressure is such an important data point. The more the war continues, the more the regime seems to be leaning into hardline consolidation rather than broad-based national integration. The Washington Post's reporting on U.S. intelligence assessments described a state becoming more heavily shaped by the Guard, not less. That fits a pattern seen in other crises. As external threat grows, parallel security institutions gain leverage over conventional ones because leaders trust ideological loyalty more than professional tradition. For the Artesh, that is a terrible environment. It means it may still be expected to absorb conventional battlefield risk without gaining corresponding political standing. And if Isfahan showed anything, it is that the regular military remains exposed precisely when the Guard's influence is expanding. Now, why does this matter beyond Iran? Because states with parallel militaries often look stronger from the outside than they really are. Redundancy can create resilience, but it can also create mistrust. Two chains of command can mean two systems competing for resources, prestige, and access to leadership. In peacetime, that competition can be managed. In war, it can become a liability. If Israeli and U.S. operations are simultaneously degrading air defense networks, missile infrastructure, aviation assets, and internal security nodes, then the pressure on Iran is not only physical, it is organizational. The state has to keep fighting externally while deciding internally which institution matters more. That is not a small dilemma. It cuts to the core of how the Islamic Republic survives. And Isfahan is where that abstract dilemma becomes concrete. Analytical assessments indicated that the combined campaign struck not only the 8th Tactical Air Base, but also other aviation and Guard-related sites in the province. Israeli public messaging also specifically referenced bases used by Basij paramilitary and internal security forces in Isfahan. That means the city was not just a battlefield point. It was a pressure point on the relationship between external defense and internal control. When those two missions collide in the same geography, every strike can expose whose mission is considered more essential. Is the top priority defending the skies, preserving missile deterrence, crushing unrest, protecting regime command? In Iran's system, those priorities do not always belong to the same institution. That is why the title needs to be handled carefully. Saying the IRGC just turned on Iran's army suggests a single decisive break that the evidence does not support. But saying the strike exposed the IRGC army power struggle is both more accurate and, frankly, more revealing. Because a hidden power struggle is more plausible than an openly declared one. It can shape logistics, resource allocation, intelligence sharing, public blame, promotion politics, and battlefield priorities without ever being announced. In that sense, the most important conflict inside Iran may not be visible in dramatic footage. It may be visible in who gets reinforced, who gets sidelined, and who is blamed after places like Isfahan are hit. The larger war context strengthens that interpretation. AP reported that around 140 U.S. troops had been injured, with 8 severely by March 10th, while the wider war had already escalated into a regional confrontation affecting Israel, Gulf states, Iraq, and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Other reporting and analysis described thousands of strikes and extensive damage across Iranian military infrastructure. Under those conditions, Tehran's leadership is not making calm institutional reforms. It is making survival decisions. And survival decisions tend to favor the institution that leaders trust most to keep the regime standing. Again, that points toward the IRGC. Another important piece here is morale. Not morale in the abstract, but institutional morale. A regular military can endure high losses if it believes the state values its role and shares its burden fairly. But morale becomes brittle if soldiers and officers suspect they are fighting inside a system where another institution holds the real power, receives the real priority, and defines the national narrative. We do not need a verified internal mutiny video to understand that this dynamic is corrosive. If Artesh personnel see Guard influence rising, while their own infrastructure takes hits, it is reasonable to conclude that distrust could deepen. That is not speculation about one dramatic event. It is a sober reading of how parallel security systems behave under extreme wartime pressure. This is also where many outside observers underestimate the IRGC's long game. The Guard does not have to beat the Artesh in a visible confrontation to win influence. It can gain ground simply by becoming the indispensable institution during national emergency. It can do that by owning internal security, strategic messaging, elite loyalty, and access to the leadership around succession and crisis management. The Washington Post, reporting on the regime becoming more dominated by the IRGC, captures exactly that. If that trend continues, then Isfahan may be remembered not only as a strike zone, but as one of the moments when the imbalance inside Iran became impossible to dismiss. And remember, even the targets tell a story. The same Isfahan battle space appears to have included Artesh aviation assets, IRGC ground force infrastructure, and BASJ course internal security sites. That is not random overlap. It reveals how intertwined Iran's military and regime security architecture has become in critical provinces. But intertwining is not the same as harmony. When multiple institutions occupy the same strategic terrain under fire, questions of command responsibility and institutional privilege become sharper. Who failed to protect what? Who withheld what? Who gets the next resources? Who gets blamed in private briefings? Those questions can alter power even if the public never hears the answers. So what is the best way to understand the ISFAHAN airbase shock? Not as proof of a confirmed IRGC civil war against the army, and not as a neat story in which one strike suddenly split the state in two. The better interpretation is that the strikes around Isfahan hit exactly the part of Iran where military weakness and political hierarchy intersect. They exposed the regular military's vulnerability, they highlighted the IRGC's expanding centrality, and they intensified the question that hangs over every dual military system in wartime. When survival is at stake, does the regime defend the country first or defend itself first? In Iran's case, the public evidence increasingly suggests those are not the same thing. That is why this story matters so much. Not because we can verify one sensational phrase, but because the truth underneath it is more consequential. Isfahan appears to show a regime under external assault and internal reordering at the same time. The Artesh is still part of Iran's defense, but the IRGC is increasingly the center of Iran's power. If the war keeps eroding conventional military infrastructure while elevating Guard dominance, the result may not be immediate collapse. It may be a harder, more suspicious, more unequal system in which the regular army becomes even more necessary militarily and even less powerful politically. And that kind of imbalance can haunt a state long after the explosions fade. In the end, the real headline is not that the IRGC just turned on the army in one provable dramatic move. The real headline is that the Isfahan strikes exposed how divided Iran's military power already was. One institution fights for the state, another fights for the regime. Under normal conditions, Tehran can blur that distinction. Under wartime pressure, it becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, every damaged runway, every destroyed hangar, every hit internal security base, and every shift in political power starts to look like part of the same story. Not just a war against Iran from the outside, but a test of which force inside Iran truly owns its future.